The room was already full when Miriam Holt stood at the front table and held up Clara's report. 40 people sat in the rows of the Aldermere Civic Hall, a long room with plaster crown moulding and windows that let in the grey light of a November afternoon. The chairs were arranged in 5 rows of 8, with 2 additional seats along the side wall for late arrivals, and every one of them was occupied. Miriam had organised it that way, down to the placement of the water pitchers and the small name placards in the front row that bore the names of people she had invited personally. Clara's name was not on any of them. Miriam held the report at shoulder height, a gesture that managed to be both casual and theatrical. It was a 40-page document bound in cream stock, and Clara had spent 11 days producing it. She had conducted the interviews, drafted the language, reconciled the budget projections with the town planning office's figures, and sat at her kitchen table the previous Saturday until past midnight, getting the footnotes right. The report was titled, "A Civic Infrastructure Review for the Aldermere Common Trust," and it bore Miriam's name on the cover. Clara sat in the 3rd row from the back, her own copy open on her knee. She had kept a copy because she had learned to keep copies of everything. Her expression was level. Around her, people who recognized Miriam's authority were already nodding, already settling into the posture of being informed rather than informing. And Clara recognized all of them, their names, their committee memberships, the small alliances they maintained with Miriam by showing up and nodding. She had worked for Miriam Holt for 5 years. She had not once seen her name in a program. There was a man sitting in the 2nd chair from the aisle in that same 3rd row, 1 seat to Clara's right. She had noticed him when she came in, the way you notice someone who is very still in a room full of people performing their presence. He wore a dark wool jacket that fit him well, a plain dress shirt, no tie, and he held no program because no one had given him one. He had not signed in at the table by the door. She had watched him bypass the sign-in table entirely, walking past it with the quiet certainty of someone who had made a decision before he arrived, and no one on the door committee had stopped him because something in his bearing made stopping him feel like a task that required a higher authority than they possessed. She reached into the side pocket of her bag and took out her spare program. She had printed 2, as she always did, because the Aldermere Society ran short every quarter, and she had learned that too, the same way she had learned about the footnotes. She leaned slightly toward him. "There's only 1 left at the door," she said, keeping her voice low. "You can have mine. I know the agenda already." He looked at the program, then at her. His eyes were dark and attentive in a way that made her feel momentarily as if she had said something more significant than she intended. He took the program. "Thank you," he said. That was all. She turned back to face the front, and Miriam began to speak. Clara had come to work for Miriam in the autumn 5 years prior, after the previous secretary had left without explanation, and the position had been posted in the Civic Society's quarterly newsletter. Clara had applied because the salary was reasonable and the work, managing correspondence, preparing briefings, scheduling the quarterly assemblies, was exactly the kind of organised, careful work she was good at. She had not understood, in that first autumn, how comprehensively Miriam's conception of a secretary extended beyond organising and into effacement. The effacement had been gradual. First, Miriam began signing letters that Clara had drafted without noting that they were drafted by her assistant, which was common enough that Clara had not objected. Then Miriam began presenting materials at meetings that Clara had researched and written, introducing them with, "I've put together a review," or "in my assessment," phrases that were not untruths, strictly speaking, but that were architectures of omission. Clara had mentioned it once, in the 2nd year, very carefully, from across Miriam's desk, and Miriam had said, "Clara, this is how professional support works. Your contribution is the position itself. She had said it with such practiced serenity that Clara had spent 3 days afterward wondering if she had misunderstood something fundamental about professional support. She had not misunderstood. She had simply been corrected into silence. By the 5th year, Clara's work was woven so completely into Miriam's public output that separating it would have required an audit of every draft, every interview note, every version file Clara kept in the organized folders on her laptop. She kept them. She had always kept them. She was not certain why, except that she was the kind of person who kept things in order, because order was its own justification. Ruth Ansley sat 1 row ahead of Clara, in the second from the back. She had turned around once when Clara came in and given her a small nod, the kind of nod that meant, "I see you, and I have always seen you." Ruth was 63, a former schoolteacher, and she had been attending these assemblies for 11 years. She had watched Miriam's tenure over the civic society with the patient, clear-eyed attention of someone who had spent a career in rooms full of people who were not yet sure what they were seeing. She had told Clara once, over tea in her kitchen, that Miriam Holt was the kind of person who genuinely could not distinguish between her own ideas and the ideas she had been given, because the distinction required a kind of self-awareness that Miriam had never found necessary. Clara had not said anything to that. She had drunk her tea and looked out Ruth's kitchen window at the November garden, the last of the dahlias bent under their own weight in the cold. At the front of the room, Miriam was describing the infrastructure report's findings. She was fluent. She was organized. She used the exact language Clara had written because it was Clara's language, built for this room. And it worked. The assembled 40 listened with the attentive courtesy that Miriam's authority produced in them, and the man in the dark wool jacket to Clara's right listened too, but differently. He held the program without looking at it. He was reading the room. When Miriam paused for a breath, he turned his head slightly toward Clara and said, very quietly, "The budget projections on page 31. Are those current figures?" She glanced at him. It was an odd question, not because it was wrong, but because it was precisely the right question. The projections on page 31 were 3 months old, updated from the planning office data she had requested in August, and she had included a footnote saying so. "They're from August," she said. "There's a footnote." He nodded once, the small nod of someone whose suspicion has been confirmed. "I saw the footnote," he said. "I wondered if anyone else had." She looked at him for a moment longer than she intended to. He had already turned back toward the front. The session continued. Miriam finished her presentation of the report and moved into the agenda's second item, which was a discussion of the Society's sponsorship accounts for the coming year. Owen Holt, Miriam's husband, handled this section from the same front table. He was a taller man with the particular confidence of someone who had spent many years being introduced into rooms by his wife, and he listed the Society's donors by tier with practiced fluency. Clara's pen moved across her notepad. She had been assigned to take minutes, as she always was, which meant she was officially a function of the meeting rather than a participant in it. When Owen reached the top-tier donors, he paused over one entry. "The third major donor this cycle," he said, "is listed under Chambers Capital Partners. They've renewed their annual commitment." He moved on without elaboration, and Clara noted it in the minutes with the same steady hand she used for everything else. She did not see the man in the dark wool jacket make any movement at that mention. During the break between agenda items, when people stood and moved toward the water pitchers and the small plates of shortbread that one of the committee members always brought, Clara stayed in her seat and reviewed her notes. She was aware that the man to her right had not gone to the refreshment table. He had also stayed in his seat, and he was watching the room with the same steady attention he had been giving it since he arrived. You wrote it, he said. She looked up from her notepad. The report, he said. You wrote it. It was not phrased as a question. She studied him for a moment. He held her gaze without apology or performance, simply waiting, the way people who are very certain of things sometimes wait. I prepared the research and the draft, she said. She kept her voice neutral. Mrs. Holt leads the society. I read the footnotes, he said, and the voice in the text doesn't match the voice in the room. That's not criticism. It's observation. She had no good answer for that. She turned back to her notepad. After a moment, she said, I'm Clara Voss. I know, he said. And then, when she looked at him again, he added, You signed the cover letter that came with the advance copy, the one sent to the donors. Your name was in the signatory line. She remembered that cover letter. She had signed it because Miriam had been travelling and asked her to send the advance package herself. She remembered thinking it was the first time her name had appeared on anything that left the office. I'm Edward, the man said. He offered nothing further. No last name, no title, no context. She accepted it the same way she had accepted everything else in 5 years of this room, with level, unornamented acknowledgement. The agenda has 3 more items, she said, looking at the program she'd given him. The third one is usually long. It usually is, he said, and something in the way he said it made her think he had been to more than one of these assemblies. She did not pursue it. Around them, the room was beginning to resettle, people returning to chairs, and Miriam was moving back toward the front table with the brisk authority of someone who kept time as a social instrument. The third agenda item was a presentation by the planning subcommittee, which Clara had also prepared and which Miriam would present. But before Miriam reached the podium, she stopped at Clara's row and looked down at her with the particular expression she used when she was about to redirect something. Clara, I'd like you to hold off on the subcommittee presentation. We're running a bit long. Miriam's voice was pleasant, the pleasantness of someone for whom pleasantness is a tool. Just keep taking minutes. I'll summarize the findings myself. There were people nearby who heard this. Ruth heard it. The man to Clara's right heard it, though he gave no sign. Clara said, Of course. She wrote the time in her notepad. Miriam moved back to the front. The meeting closed an hour later, with the formal motion to adjourn and the small social noise of 40 people gathering coats and exchanging pleasantries. Clara capped her pen and clipped her notepad shut. She had 12 pages of minutes in her neat, consistent hand, 12 pages that would become the official record of a session she had not been permitted to speak in except to hand something over. She was about to stand when she heard Miriam's voice from the corridor to the right of the hall, where the coatroom was, speaking in the lowered but not truly quiet register of someone who expects to be partially overheard only by people who don't matter. Owen, I need you to listen to me on this. The planning subcommittee work is going to the full board next month, and I need it framed properly. Clara will draft it, obviously, because she's very good at the drafting, but the board doesn't need to know the origins. They need to know the conclusions. Owen said something too low to catch. Miriam said, She is not a public figure. She will never be a public figure as long as I chair this society. That's not cruelty, Owen, that's clarity. The society's credibility rests on its leadership, not on its staff. Clara's contribution is valued, but her name on a board document would be confusing. Clara stood very still in the aisle. The crowd around her moved and murmured. Ruth passed her, then stopped, reading her face. Clara, Ruth said quietly. I'm fine, Clara said. She gathered her things. She stood in the Aldermere Civic Hall at 5:17 in the afternoon, in the November light that was already becoming dusk, and she understood with a clarity that cost her something to hold that Miriam had not made a mistake about her. Miriam had made a policy. She had been managed rather than overvalued, kept rather than recognized, and the space between those things was 5 years wide. She looked at her bag. Inside it, along with her notepad and pen and the spare program she had not given away, was a separate folder, cream stock, slim. She had prepared it the night before, uncertain whether she would use it. It contained a copy of the infrastructure report, with her name in the author field, not Miriam's, and a one-page cover sheet addressed to Thomas Wythe, the Assembly's official recording secretary, requesting that the document be entered into the Assembly's formal record under the name of its author. She had not known when she prepared it that she was going to submit it. She had simply prepared it, the way she prepared everything, in case. She walked to the side table where Thomas Wythe was stacking his folders, a slight man with wire-rimmed glasses who handled the Society's paperwork with the meticulous neutrality of a person who understood that records were not the same as opinions. "Thomas," she said, "I have a document for the Assembly record." He looked at the folder she held out to him. "This session's record?" "Yes. A full version of the infrastructure report, with the authorship noted correctly." She kept her voice level. "I'd like it entered before the session officially closes." Thomas looked at the cover sheet, looked at her name, and then looked at her with the expression of someone who is deciding whether a thing falls within his jurisdiction. It did. She knew it did. The Assembly bylaws permitted any participant to submit documentation to the record within 30 minutes of adjournment, and the 30 minutes had not elapsed. "I'll need to verify the session is still open," he said. "I checked the time," she said. "It is." He accepted the folder. She walked back through the thinning room. Her hands were steady. She had not raised her voice. She had not offered an explanation to anyone. She had done a precise, ordinary thing, and it had cost her everything she had, which was a kind of courage that made no noise. She was reaching for her coat on the back of her chair when she heard the door to the corridor open, and the click of heels on the hall's wood floor, and a voice she did not recognize. A young woman's voice, brisk with the particular urgency of professional purpose. "Mr. Chambers," the voice carried clearly across the nearly empty room. "I'm so sorry. The car was delayed on the Aldermere Road. I have the Langford documents and the week's correspondence, and the board is requesting confirmation of your attendance at Thursday's meeting." The room had not fully emptied. Miriam was still near the front table speaking with 2 committee members. Owen was in the doorway. Ruth had paused by the coat rack. Thomas Wythe had looked up from his folders. 6 or 7 people remained in various positions around the room, and they all heard it. The same way you hear something when the ambient noise drops out at exactly the wrong moment and leaves a clear channel for a sentence to travel through. The woman who had spoken was young, perhaps 25, in a charcoal coat with a leather portfolio under her arm, and she was looking at the man in the dark wool jacket who was standing by the row of chairs 3 from the back, holding the program Clara had given him, now folded in half. He had not moved. He was looking at his secretary with an expression that Clara could not quite read from where she stood, a look that was not embarrassment and not alarm, but something more contained than either. "Thank you, Nora," he said. "We'll handle it outside." But Nora was already looking around the room with the habituated awareness of an executive assistant entering a professional space, taking account of who was present, noting exits and introductions not yet made, and her gaze landed on the front table where Miriam Holt had gone very still. "Should I let Mr. Harmon know you're present at the Aldermere Society this quarter?" Nora said, already pulling her phone from the portfolio. "He mentioned the society is under the Chambers Capital Partners civic umbrella." The room was quiet enough to hear the radiator at the far wall. Miriam said, "I'm sorry?" Her voice had changed in a small but audible way, the way a surface changes when a thin layer is removed from it. Owen turned from the doorway and looked at the man in the dark jacket. Ruth looked at Clara. Clara stood with her coat half on, one arm in, one arm not, and she looked at the man who had told her his name was Edward, and had asked about the footnote on page 31 and had accepted her spare program with 2 words of thanks. She looked at him and understood, in the particular way you understand things that have been arranged to surprise you, but that, once seen, look as though they were always inevitable, that she had not known what she was handing a program to. He had known from the beginning of that sentence exactly what she was not knowing, and he had let her not know, and had asked about the footnote anyway. Edward set the folded program on the back of the chair in front of him. He straightened. He did not change his expression. He said to the room in general, in the same measured, quiet voice he had used to tell her the voices didn't match, "I apologize for the informality. I asked to be seated without introduction this quarter. I find assemblies more useful when I can hear the room rather than perform for it." Miriam's mouth opened. Owen said, "Chambers Capital Partners." He said it the way you say something when you are confirming that the floor is, in fact, not solid. "We've been the primary donor to the Aldermere Civic Society for 4 years, Edward said. "The annual commitment is renewed in October. Owen has the documentation." Owen did have the documentation. He had presented it himself 40 minutes ago, standing at the front table, and had moved past the entry without elaboration because it was a line item, a figure, one among several, and he had not known what name to put a face to. Miriam took a step toward the centre of the room. Clara watched her do it, watched the recalibration happening in real time, the social machinery of a very organized person encountering a situation that their organization had not accounted for. "Mr. Chambers," Miriam said. Her voice had recovered most of its surface composure, not all of it. "We're deeply grateful for your firm's support. I had no idea you were planning to attend in person." "I didn't announce it," he said. That was deliberate. A short pause. "Of course," Miriam said. She looked around the room with the particular instinct of someone whose authority is a performance, and who needs the performance to continue in order to survive the next several minutes. Her eyes passed over Clara. Then, with the smallest hesitation, returned to her. Clara had finished putting on her coat. She stood with her bag on her shoulder and her hands at her sides, and she did not look away from Miriam, but she did not advance on her either. She simply was there, in the room, occupying her own position without apology or demand. Nora had crossed to Edward's side and was showing him something in the portfolio. He looked at it briefly, then looked up, and his gaze found Clara across the room with the directness of someone who knows exactly where a person is standing. "Mrs. Holt," he said, "I'd like to discuss the infrastructure report. The full version, with the complete authorship noted." He paused. "My firm will want a direct liaison for the planning phase, someone who understands the footnotes." Ruth made a small sound that was not quite a laugh, and not quite anything else. She covered it with her hand. Miriam said, "Of course, I can arrange for our team to meet with your office, and I'd be happy to personally represent the Society's research capacity." "I was thinking of Miss Voss," Edward said. The sentence landed in the room without drama and without apology. Clara heard her own name spoken in that quiet room by a person whose name now meant something in it that it had not meant 4 minutes ago. And she felt something that was not triumph, not vindication exactly, but something older and simpler than either. The particular sensation of having been seen by someone who was looking at exactly the right thing. Miriam said nothing for a moment. Then she said, "Clara has been invaluable in a support capacity." "I'm sure she has," Edward said. He looked at Nora. "Please note for Mr. Harmon that we'll want Miss Voss as the primary point of contact for the Aldermere project." Nora was already writing. Owen had moved back into the room from the doorway. He stood by the coat rack with his coat over his arm and an expression that had simplified considerably from the one he'd worn during his presentation of the donor tears. He was looking at his wife. She was looking at the floor in front of the front table, and then she was looking at Clara. And what was in that look was not remorse exactly, because Miriam was not built for remorse exactly, but it was recognition. And it was the first time in 5 years that Clara had seen Miriam recognize her as something other than a function. She did not perform anything in response to it. She held Miriam's gaze for 3 seconds, which was long enough, and then she turned to Thomas Wythe, who was standing with her cream folder held carefully in his hands. "Thomas," she said, "is the session officially closed?" "2 minutes ago," he said. "Is the record current?" "It is," he said, and he held up the folder slightly, the way you hold up something you are about to file correctly. "It'll be in the archive by end of week." She nodded. She thanked him, because that was who she was when no one was watching, and also when everyone was. Ruth came to stand beside her, not saying anything, just settling into the space beside her with the ease of someone who has long known where they belong in relation to a person they admire. Ruth had watched all of it. She had watched it with the patient clarity she had developed in 11 years of these assemblies, and she would probably think about it for a long time, would probably tell it over tea in her kitchen with the same voice she used to tell stories she had lived with for years and still felt the tremors of. Clara thought she might sit in Ruth's kitchen again sometime soon. She thought she might let herself be seen being glad. People had begun to leave in the small drifts of the post-meeting departure, collecting coats, exchanging the muted pleasantries of people who had witnessed something they were still processing. Miriam and Owen moved toward the front door together, not speaking to each other and not speaking to Clara, and the space they left when they passed through the door was quieter than the space before them. Nora was conducting a murmured exchange with Edward near the side wall, the kind of precise logistical exchange Clara recognized from her own professional life, the scheduling of a thing that had just become relevant. Edward listened, answered in brief, looked across the room once more at Clara, and then said something quiet to Nora that sent her toward the door with the portfolio. He crossed the room. He stopped in front of her, and for a moment, neither of them said anything, because the moment was not asking for words, it was asking to be held still for a count of 3. "The footnotes were good," he said. She almost smiled. She recognized the economy of it, the same economy she used herself, the discipline of the smallest sufficient sentence. "Thank you for the program," he said. "You're welcome," she said. Ruth, beside her, was looking at the ceiling with the expression of a woman doing her utmost to appear as though she was hearing nothing. "I'll have Nora send across the details of the project scope this week," he said. "I think there's considerable work to be done if you're interested in it." Clara looked at him. 5 years of invisible labor, 11 days on a 40-page report, a cover letter she had signed because Miriam was traveling, a spare program she had printed out of habit, a question about a footnote that lasted 4 minutes and that she had not understood until now. "I'm interested," she said. He nodded. That was enough, in the way that things are enough when everything that needed to be said has been said by the arrangement of what preceded them. He walked toward the door, pausing once to pick up the program he had left on the back of the chair, the folded copy she had given him at the start of the session. He tucked it into the breast pocket of his jacket. She watched him do it, and then he was through the door, and the November light from the corridor windows was across the empty row of chairs, where they had both been sitting 3 rows from the back. Ruth said, "Well?" Clara said, "Yes." "I've been coming to these assemblies for 11 years, Ruth said. She sounded almost amused in the careful way she always was. "That's the first time I've seen Miriam Holt lose the room." "She didn't lose it," Clara said. "She just had to share it." Ruth looked at her with the particular warmth of someone who knows a person well enough to recognize when they are being more generous than the situation strictly requires, and who loves them for it. The room was almost empty now. Thomas Wythe had taken his folders and his archive binders and gone. The committee members who had lingered were pulling on coats. The water pitchers sat on the side table, half empty, the shortbread plate down to crumbs. The overhead lights were still on, casting the long room in a warm, institutional yellow that made everything in it look both ordinary and precise. Clara walked to the table at the front of the room. Not Miriam's table, not the presenter's table, just the long, central table around which the 40 chairs were arranged. She set her bag down on the surface. She pulled out her notepad, not because there was anything left to write, but because setting it there made the gesture complete. She was standing at the front of the Aldermere Civic Hall in the last of the afternoon light, her notepad on the table, her coat on, and under her right palm was the flat cream surface of the table where, for 5 years, she had sat in the rows and taken minutes for meetings she had prepared. The table was solid oak, worn smooth at the edges where hands had rested on it across many years of civic business, and it felt, under her palm, exactly like a surface she was allowed to stand at. Ruth came and stood beside her again, as she had been doing all evening, and neither of them felt the need to say anything further about it. The program she had kept, her own copy, the one she had not given away, was still in her bag. She left it there. She had the room. She had the record. She had, in the breast pocket of a dark wool jacket currently being carried through the November street outside, the other copy, the one she had handed over without reading the room, without calculating, without anything except the plain recognition that a person was present and did not have what they needed. She had not known what that would mean. It had not needed to mean anything, at the time, to be worth doing. She stood at the table until the overhead lights clicked into their half-power evening setting, and the room settled around her into something that felt, for the first time in 5 years of coming here, like a place she did not have to make herself smaller to occupy.